The frost came early that year, and it came for the lavender first. Margaret Elspeth Hartley knelt in the cold dirt behind the kitchens of Fenwick Hall long after the rest of the house had gone to bed, wrapping the cracked clay pots and old sacking with hands that had gone numb an hour before. She was 45 years old. She had been kneeling in gardens, in one way or another, for most of her life, and she had stopped expecting anyone to notice. The moon gave her just enough light to see by. She worked in silence because silence was a thing she had grown skilled at, the way other women grew skilled at dancing or drawing or saying clever things at dinner. Margaret had never been permitted the luxury of being clever out loud. She had only ever been permitted to be useful and quiet and out of the way. She lived at Fenwick Hall as a companion to her cousin's wife, Cordelia, which was a word that made the arrangement sound gentler than it was. In practice, it meant she mended what needed mending, wrote what needed writing, managed a household that would never once be called her own, and came and went through the servants' passage after dark, as though her presence in the main halls by daylight were a thing to be rationed. She ate what was left. She slept in a room at the top of the house where the cold came in around the window frame, no matter how carefully she stuffed it with cloth. She had grown so used to being looked past that she sometimes tested it, standing very still in a doorway to see how many people would walk through the room without once turning their head toward her. It was, she told herself, only curiosity. It was not loneliness. She had decided a long time ago that loneliness was a thing she could not afford to feel, because there was no one waiting on the other side of it to comfort her, and a feeling with nowhere to go was only a weight. She had been engaged once. She had been 19, and his name had been Thomas, and he had been a lieutenant with a laugh that filled up whatever room he stood in, which was not a talent Margaret had ever possessed herself, but which she had loved in him without envy, the way one loves the sun without wishing to be it. He had gone to sea in the spring, and by autumn there had come a letter that was not from him, written in another man's hand, telling her with careful kindness that the ship had gone down in a storm off the Portuguese coast, and that there had been no time for anyone to write last words, and that she should know he had spoken of her often and with great tenderness in the weeks before. That was 26 years ago. Margaret had worn her plainness ever since, like a penance she had not quite been sentenced to, but had chosen to serve anyway, certain, in the quiet, unspoken way a person becomes certain of things they have never said aloud, that whatever chance at love had been allotted to her in this life had gone down with that ship, and that the rest of her days were simply the paying out of a debt to a happiness she had been allowed to hold for one single year. Her lavender was the only thing that answered her care with something beautiful. It grew in pots no bigger than a wash basin, tucked against the kitchen wall where the cook's boy sometimes knocked them over reaching for firewood, and everyone in the house had, at one time or another, made some remark about an old maid's foolish habit of tending flowers no one had asked for. Margaret let the remarks pass over her the way she let most things pass over her. She kept growing the lavender anyway. It was, though she would never have said so, the only living thing in her life that had not yet learned to expect nothing from her. The cruelty in that house had a name, and the name was Cordelia. Cordelia Hartley was 11 years younger than Margaret, and had married into comfort rather than into affection, a fact she had spent a decade trying not to know about herself, and which came out sideways, in small, precise cuts that never quite rose to the level of a blow. It was a seating chart that always placed Margaret nearest the kitchen door. It was a joke about spinsters, pitched to Carrie, just far enough to be overheard by guests. It was a letter of introduction that went missing the week before a ball where a widower of good fortune might have taken notice of a plain, sensible woman with kind eyes. Cordelia never raised her voice. She did not need to. She had learned, long before Margaret came to live under her roof, that the quietest cruelties are the hardest to answer, because no one can quite point to the moment the wound was made. What Cordelia did not know, what she could not have said even to herself in the dark, was that her cruelty was not really about Margaret at all. It was about a mirror. Margaret's plainness asked for nothing and expected nothing, and bore its disappointments with a dignity that had cost her a great deal and showed itself not at all. And Cordelia, who had traded her own heart for a house and a title and a name that opened doors, could not stand to look at that dignity too long, because it showed her, more clearly than she wished to see, the shape of the choice she herself had made. It was into this small, cold, careful life that the Duke of Ashcombe arrived, on a night when the frost had already begun to whiten the grass, expecting nothing more than a fortnight of tedious business and a great deal of bad tea. The Duke of Ashcombe was 51 years old and had not been much seen in society in the 9 years since his wife had died. She had gone quietly and without pain in the 3rd year of a decline no physician had ever named to his satisfaction, and her family had never quite forgiven him for a much older wound, a broken betrothal from his own youth, entered into for reasons that had made sense to him at 20 and had haunted him at every age since, which had cost a young woman of good family her best chance at a comfortable life. It had not been entirely his fault. He had told himself that for 30 years and had never once believed it completely. He had carried the debt of that old conscience the way some men carry a limp, learning to walk around it so well that most people never noticed it was there at all. He had come to Fenwick Hall only to settle a matter of land boundaries with Margaret's cousin, a business he expected to conclude in an afternoon of maps and mild disagreement. Instead, on his very first evening, restless in a strange house and unable to sleep, he found the side gate to the kitchen garden propped open against the cold, and followed a small, unsteady light through the dark, expecting to catch a thief, or at best a careless servant. What he found instead was a woman on her knees in the frost, wrapping clay pots in sacking with the tender, exact care of someone handling something far more precious than a handful of dried flowers, speaking to the plants under her breath, as though they might be frightened and needed comforting before the cold could reach them. He said nothing that night. He stood in the shadow of the wall and watched her finish the work, watched her rise stiffly and press one cold hand briefly against her lower back, watched her look once, almost apologetically, toward the dark windows of the house, as though checking that no one had seen her do a thing she loved. Then he went back inside and told no one what he had seen, and found that he could not, for the rest of that long fortnight, stop noticing her. There was, in the top drawer of Margaret's writing desk, beneath a stack of household ledgers she kept in a hand so neat it might have been engraved, a single letter that had never been sent. She had written it in the 3rd week after the news came, when grief was still too raw to be called by its proper name, and she had addressed it to a young lieutenant who would never read it, because there was, by then, no ship left to carry it to him and no shore left for him to stand on to receive it. She had written it anyway. She had told him about the garden she meant to plant if he came home. She had told him she was not afraid, though she had been, terribly. She had told him that she forgave him for going to sea in the first place, though there had never been anything to forgive, because a man who loves his country and his duty is not a man who has wronged the woman waiting for him. She had sealed the letter, and then found she could not send a letter to a man with no address left in this world, and so she had kept it instead, folded small, moved from drawer to drawer through every house she had lived in since, 26 years of drawers. 26 years of a letter that said everything she had never said to anyone living. She had been 19 when she met him, at an assembly she had not wanted to attend, wearing a gown her mother had let out at the seams, because there had been no money for a new one that season. Thomas had asked her to dance not because she was the prettiest woman in the room. She had never been that, not even at 19, not even in her own kindest memory of herself, but because, he told her afterward, she had been the only person in the room who had looked as though she were actually listening to the music instead of merely enduring it. He had a way of finding what was true about a person and saying it plainly, without decoration, and Margaret, who had spent her whole young life being complimented on things that did not matter and overlooked in the things that did, had fallen in love with him for that alone, before she had even properly learned the color of his eyes. They had been engaged for 1 year. It had been, she would later understand, the only year of her life in which she had been permitted to simply be happy without earning it first, without paying some other part of herself to afford it. Then the ship had gone down in a storm no one could have predicted and no one could have prevented, and the man who wrote to tell her had been kind enough to say that Thomas had spoken of her often in his last weeks, which was, Margaret suspected even then, the sort of kindness a stranger offers to soften a blow he cannot otherwise soften, and which she had chosen to believe completely anyway, because a person in grief is entitled to believe the version of the story that lets her keep breathing. What no one at Fenwick Hall knew, not Cordelia, not her cousin, not the servants who whispered about the odd spinster and her flower pots, was that Margaret had never once, in 26 years, allowed herself to be courted by another man, not because no one had tried, but because she had come to believe, quietly and completely, that love had been a single gift given to her early and used up entirely, the way a candle is used up, and that what remained to her now was only the small, steady warmth of tending things that could not disappoint her. A garden, a household ledger, a cousin's children who called her Aunt Margaret, and never once wondered why she never married. She had built, out of that belief, a life that did not ask very much of the world, because she had decided the world did not have very much left to give her, and a life that asks for little is, in its own bruised way, a kind of safety. It was this that the Duke of Ashcombe began, without meaning to see. He had not come to Fenwick Hall looking for anything beyond a resolved property line, and a quiet fortnight before returning to Ashcombe House, where his own rooms had stood mostly unused since his wife's passing, kept clean and cold and waiting by servants who had long since stopped asking him whether he meant to open them again. He was not a man given to noticing companions and poor relations. Society had trained him, as it trained everyone, to look through such women the way one looks through a window, seeing only what lies beyond. But having once seen Margaret Hartley on her knees in the frost, speaking gently to a row of flower pots, he found he could no longer manage the trick of looking through her. He began, instead, to look at her carefully, the way a man studies a room he suspects holds something valuable he has not yet found. He noticed at breakfast that she was given the coldest end of the table and never once complained of it. He noticed in the hall the particular way she stepped back to let others pass first. Always, even children, always, as though she had long ago decided that space itself was a thing that belonged to other people and only ever lent to her. He noticed that she remembered the name of every under-housemaid's child and asked after them by name, and that when a dessert was brought round she was, without fail, the one person at the table who declined it before anyone could think to offer it to her twice. He began to understand slowly that he was watching a woman who had trained herself out of wanting things in front of other people, and he found himself wondering, with a curiosity that surprised him, what she might want, if she ever allowed herself to say it out loud. Their first real conversation happened by accident, in the small library at the back of the house, 3 days after his arrival. Margaret had gone there before the household was awake, as she did most mornings, to correct an error she had found in the previous quarter's accounts, a column of figures her cousin's steward had added wrong, and no one else had troubled to check. She did not hear the door. She was bent over the ledger with a candle burned nearly to the dish, murmuring the sums under her breath the way she murmured to her flowers, and she did not know she was no longer alone until a voice, low and unhurried, said from the doorway, "You have found an error in 3 minutes that my own man of business took a fortnight to discover last spring." She startled and closed the ledger too quickly and said, before she could stop herself, "It is not my place to discover errors, Your Grace, only to correct them once I have." "Those seem to me the same skill," he said, coming further into the room, "practiced by 2 very different sorts of people. Most who possess it make certain everyone knows it. You, I think, would have said nothing at all if I had not walked in." There was nothing to say. The steward will find the correction in the margin and think he made it himself. That will save him some embarrassment and cost me nothing. It costs you the crediting of your own work. Margaret looked at him then, properly, for the first time. A tall man past 50, with a face that had settled into gravity, the way some faces settle into ease, gray at the temples, eyes that seemed to be doing more arithmetic than the ledger required. "I have found, Your Grace," she said, "that credit is a costly thing to want. It is much cheaper to want the work done correctly, and let the wanting stop there." He did not answer at once. He looked at her the way he had looked at the frost-wrapped pots 3 nights before, as though she had said something that required a longer accounting than he had time to give it just then. "That," he said finally, "is either the wisest thing I have heard spoken in this house, or the saddest. I confess I cannot yet tell which. Perhaps it is both, Your Grace. I find the wisest things usually are." She curtsied then, and excused herself before he could ask anything further, because 30 years of practice had taught her that conversations which began to interest her were conversations she could not afford to want to continue. She did not see the way he watched the door after she had gone, turning her words over as a man turns over a coin he suspects might be worth more than its face. He thought of her that whole day during his tedious business with her cousin, maps spread across a table, boundary lines argued over with the mild, grinding patience such matters required. He thought of the steadiness in her voice when she had spoken of costly wanting, and he began to suspect that a woman does not learn to speak so plainly about the cost of wanting unless she has at some point wanted a great deal and paid for it, and decided never to be so unguarded again. He was a man who understood the shape of such decisions rather well. He had made several of his own. That evening at dinner, he watched Cordelia direct a small, unkind joke at Margaret's expense. Something about spinsters and their gardens, delivered lightly enough that no one but Margaret seemed to feel its edge. And he watched Margaret's face do nothing at all, not flinch, not color, not fall, only continue its polite attention to whatever had been said before, as though the words had passed through her without finding anywhere to land. It was, he thought, a considerable feat of composure. It was also, he thought, watching her hands go very still in her lap for just a moment before resuming their careful stillness. Not composure at all, but its cousin, the long-practiced art of surviving what one cannot prevent. He resolved, without entirely admitting to himself that he had resolved anything, to stay at Fenwick Hall longer than the fortnight required. He began, in the days that followed, to set her small tests, though he would not have called them that, and would have been somewhat ashamed to hear them named so plainly. He arranged, through a word to his own secretary, for an invitation to a neighboring house's card party to be misdirected so that it arrived in Margaret's hands instead of Cordelia's, and watched from across the breakfast room to see what she would do with a piece of good fortune that was not, strictly speaking, hers. She read it, understood at once that it had been meant for her cousin's wife, and carried it to Cordelia herself before the tea had finished being poured, without comment, without the smallest visible wish to keep it. "This came to me in error, I believe," was all she said. Cordelia took it without thanks, the way one takes back a thing one had never imagined losing, and Margaret returned to her chair as though nothing at all had happened. He left another afternoon, a page of estate accounts on the library table where he knew she would find it, figures deliberately left unresolved. A small trap of arithmetic, he told himself, was only idle curiosity, and knew, in some quieter part of himself, was nothing of the kind. He found it the next morning with the error corrected in the margin, in that same neat engraved hand, and beneath it, a short note he had not asked for and had not expected. "I hope you will forgive the liberty. I could not leave it as it stood." He read the note perhaps a dozen times before he burned it, not because it embarrassed him to keep it, but because he found he did not trust himself yet to explain, even to himself, why he wished to. He began watching her at odd hours, the way a man watches whether he suspects is about to change. He saw her, one gray afternoon, sitting with the housekeeper's youngest boy, who had been kept from his lessons with a fever that would not break, patiently teaching him his letters from a battered primer while the boy's mother scrubbed floors 2 rooms away, unable to spare the time herself. He saw her give up, without being asked and without anyone noticing but himself, her own portion of a Sunday joint to a kitchen maid whose family had gone hungry over a hard month, claiming she had eaten too well at luncheon to want it, a claim he happened to know was false, having watched her eat almost nothing at luncheon at all. He began to understand that what he was watching was not performance. Performance, in his long experience of ballrooms and drawing rooms, always angled itself toward an audience. Margaret's kindness had no audience in mind. It simply went where it was needed and then disappeared, the way water disappears into dry ground, leaving no mark of having passed through except the thing it had fed. She, for her part, did not know she was being watched at all, or told herself she did not, though there were moments, a particular stillness in the Duke's attention across a room, a question asked that seemed to require more of an answer than its words strictly demanded. When something in her chest gave a small, unfamiliar lurch, quickly suppressed, quickly reasoned away. She was 45. She had buried the habit of hoping so thoroughly, so long ago, that she no longer entirely trusted herself to recognize its return. When she caught the Duke's eyes on her at dinner one evening, steady and unreadable, she told herself it was only that she had spilled something on her sleeve or worn her hair carelessly, and looked down at her plate until the feeling passed. It was in the walled garden on a mild afternoon nearly a week into his stay that they spoke longest. She had gone out to see to the lavender, checking the sacking she had wrapped around the pots, and found him already there, standing with his hands behind his back, studying the bare winter beds as though they held some great puzzle. "You grow a great deal of one thing for so small a plot," he observed, as she knelt to check the frost had not gotten in. "Lavender does not ask for much," she said. "It wants poor soil and a great deal of sun and very little pity, and it gives back more than it takes. I have found that a rare quality in a living thing. You speak of it as though it were a person. I have known persons less reliable, Your Grace." He almost smiled at that. She saw the shape of it pass across his face and disappear before it fully arrived, as though smiling too were a habit he had let go rusty from disuse. "May I ask you something that is not, perhaps, my place to ask?" "You may ask. I cannot promise to answer." "Fair enough." He was quiet a moment, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground. "Do you never wish for more than this? A room at the top of a house that is not your own? A garden the size of a tablecloth? A life spent minding other people's children and other people's accounts?" Margaret did not answer at once. She finished tucking the sacking around the last pot before she spoke, because her hands needed something to do while her voice found its footing. "I wished for a great many things once," she said finally. "I have found that wishing, past a certain age, becomes a kind of cruelty a person practices upon herself. So I have stopped wishing and started tending instead. It is a smaller thing. It asks less of the world, and the world, in my experience, has very little patience for being asked." "That is not an answer to my question." "No," she agreed. "It is the answer I have instead of one." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face. She would think of it often, afterward, though she could not have named it precisely at the time. Looked almost like recognition, as though she had described a country he too had once lived in. "I was engaged to be married once," he said, "before my wife, to a woman I did not love as I ought to have, and I ended it badly, and cost her a great deal in the process, more than I fully understood, until it was long past mending. I have spent 30 years telling myself the debt is paid because I have suffered for it. I am no longer certain suffering is the same thing as payment." Margaret looked up at him, surprised into stillness by the plainness of the confession. "Why do you tell me this, Your Grace?" "Because you spoke of wishing as a cruelty one practices on oneself, and I recognized the sentence. I have practiced a version of it myself for 30 years, on a debt I am not sure I am owed permission to stop paying." He held her gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. "I find I would like to know a great deal more about the woman who tends lavender no one asked her to grow, and corrects accounts no one will thank her for, and gives up her dinner to hungry children when she thinks no one is watching." Margaret's breath caught, very slightly, and she covered it by rising and brushing the dirt from her skirts. "You flatter a plain woman, Your Grace. It is not a kindness. It only makes the return to ordinary life harder to bear." "I do not flatter," he said quietly. "I have very little use for flattery, and even less patience for it. I only say what I see." She left him standing among the bare winter beds, her heart beating in a way she had not permitted it to beat in 26 years, and told herself, walking back to the house, that she must be more careful. She did not entirely believe herself. Cordelia had, of course, noticed. She had noticed the way the Duke's eyes found Margaret across a room before they found anyone else. She had noticed the length of the conversation in the walled garden, watched through a window with her jaw set hard enough to ache. She had noticed, most of all, the small, dangerous fact that a Duke of Ashcombe's attention, once caught, was not easily uncaught, and that if it settled where it appeared to be settling, the whole shape of the household, the small, careful hierarchy of who mattered and who did not, who sat where at dinner and who wrote the invitations and whose name came first in every polite sentence, would be overturned in a single season. She told herself this was a matter of principle, of propriety, of a companion forgetting her place. She did not examine too closely the colder, older fear underneath it, that a plain woman with nothing at all, who had never once tried to be chosen, was on the verge of being chosen anyway, by a man of consequence, for reasons that had nothing to do with fortune or beauty, or the careful architecture of ambition Cordelia herself had built her whole life upon. It was not a thought Cordelia could afford to sit with for long. So she did what she had always done, with feelings too large and too shaming to examine. She turned them into action, quick and cold and precise. The county assembly was held that year in the last week of the Duke's stay, in the long ballroom of Fenwick Hall itself, and half the county had been invited, drawn as much by curiosity about the reclusive Duke of Ashcombe as by the dancing. Margaret had not wanted to attend at all. She had no gown fit for such an evening, only a gray silk let out twice already, and no appetite for standing at the edge of a crowded room being not quite looked at by people who had known her family for 20 years and still could not have said, if pressed, what color her eyes were. But Cordelia had insisted, with a bright, brittle insistence that Margaret, looking back, would understand only too late had been the insistence of a woman setting a trap and wanting her victim inside the room to spring it. The evening began well enough. The candles were lit, the musicians tuned their instruments, the great room filled with silk and laughter and the particular nervous energy of a county assembly that has, for once, something worth gossiping about. The Duke arrived late, as was his habit, and Margaret watched from the edge of the room as he was drawn immediately into a circle of eager introductions, mothers angling daughters toward him with the frank, unembarrassed hunger of women who had waited years for a duke to be within reach. She told herself she had no claim to mind this. She told herself, watching him incline his head politely to a young woman half his age, that whatever had passed between them in the walled garden had been a kindness, nothing more, extended to a lonely woman by a man too well-mannered to withhold it. She was still telling herself this when Cordelia crossed the floor toward her, smiling the particular bright smile she wore only when she meant to do harm. "Margaret, dear," Cordelia said, pitching her voice with the precise, practiced carry of a woman who has learned exactly how far a whisper will travel in a crowded room. "I was only just telling Lady Buxton the sad little story of your engagement, how very hard it must have been to be jilted so, and by a man who went off to sea rather than face you at the altar." The words landed like a struck bell. Conversation near them faltered, then spread its faltering outward in widening rings, the way disturbance moves across still water. Margaret felt the blood leave her face. "That is not what happened," she said, and her voice, though quiet, did not shake, because 30 years of practiced dignity did not abandon her even now, even here, even with the worst thing she had ever feared finally, publicly, spoken aloud. "Lieutenant Ashford died at sea. He did not leave me. He was not able to return to me." Of course," Cordelia said, with a soft, terrible sympathy that was worse than any open cruelty could have been, because it left Margaret nothing solid to push against. "Though I have heard it told rather differently by those who knew the family, that there was some trouble beforehand, some falling out, that the engagement was rather more broken than the story generally allows." She let the words hang there, unproven and unprovable and therefore impossible to fully answer, the way rumor always is, and turned to the small gathered crowd with an expression of gentle, regretful confidence. "I only mention it because I should hate for anyone to be under a false impression of poor Margaret's history. One does not like to see a person's true character misunderstood." The music had not stopped, but it seemed to Margaret, standing at the center of that widening silence, that it had gone very far away, the way sound goes far away in the moment just before a person faints. Old whispers she had thought long buried stirred back to life around her. She had heard, over the years, faint echoes of the same ugly rumor, always at a distance, always unattributed, and had told herself it could not matter, since it was not true, since the only two people who had known the whole truth of her engagement were herself and a young lieutenant 26 years dead. She had not accounted for the particular cruelty of a rumor, with no living witness left to contradict it, spoken now in this room, in front of the one man whose good opinion had, without her ever quite admitting it to herself, come to matter to her more than any opinion had mattered in 26 years. She looked, despite every instinct that told her not to, toward where the Duke stood across the room. He had gone very still. She could not read his face at that distance, and the not knowing was its own particular agony, worse in that moment than the humiliation itself. She thought of the letter in her writing desk, 26 years folded small, and thought, with a kind of hollow clarity, that the one private grief she had never once had to defend to anyone was now standing exposed in the middle of a ballroom, twisted into something ugly by a woman who had never once, in 11 years, troubled to ask her what had truly happened. She did not cry. She had trained herself too long against crying in public for that particular dam to break now, of all moments, in front of all these people. But she felt something in her chest that had held steady through 26 years of small daily diminishments finally begin, quietly, to give way. And she understood, with the strange calm that comes just before a person breaks entirely, that she did not have the strength left to defend herself against a lie with no name and no author and no way of being disproven. She stood very straight and said nothing further, and waited in the center of the floor for whatever was going to happen next to happen, because there was nothing else left for her to do. It was the Duke who crossed the floor. He did not hurry, and he did not raise his voice, and it was precisely this, the unhurried, unshaken quiet of a man who does not need volume to command a room, that made every head turn to watch him come. He walked the length of the ballroom with the particular authority of a man who has spent his whole life being listened to and has never once had to shout for it. And he came to a stop beside Margaret, close enough that she could feel, even through her own numbness, the steadiness he brought with him like a second, sturdier pulse. "I find I must correct a misapprehension," he said, and though his voice was not loud, it carried, the way certain voices carry not through volume, but through the simple, unarguable fact of being trusted. "I spent 3 days this week at the home of Lieutenant Thomas Ashford's surviving family on a matter of business unrelated to this evening, and while I was there, his sister was good enough to show me the last letter he ever wrote, kept these 26 years in the family Bible, unopened by any hand but hers until I asked to see it." He paused and let his eyes move once, deliberately, around the room, so that no one present could later claim they had not heard him plainly. That letter states, in his own hand, dated the week before his ship went down, that he had never in his life been more certain of anything than his engagement to Miss Margaret Hartley, and that he counted the days until he could return and marry her. There was no falling out. There was no broken engagement. There was only a young man lost at sea, and a young woman who has spent 26 years grieving him with a loyalty most of us in this room have never once been asked to summon for anyone. The silence that followed was different in kind from the silence that had come before. No longer the silence of a crowd waiting to see someone fall, but the silence of a crowd realizing, all at once, that it had very nearly watched something cruel happen and called it gossip. He turned then, not toward Cordelia, whom he did not so much as look at, but toward Margaret herself, and his voice dropped to something quieter, meant for her alone, though the whole room could still hear it. "I did not go to Ashford House by accident," he said. "I went because I could not bear the thought of a lie about you going unanswered, even a lie I had not yet heard spoken. I am glad now that I went when I did." Margaret stood very still, one hand pressed lightly to the letter she was not holding, the one that lived instead in a drawer at the top of the house, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched for 26 years finally, carefully, begin to loosen, too. "You went to Ashford House," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not break. "For me." "I went," he said, "because I have come, in a very short time, to think a great deal of your good name, and could not stand by and watch it taken from you by a lie with no truth in it at all." He held her gaze, steady, unhurried, entirely unconcerned with the dozens of eyes now fixed upon them both. "I should have told you before this evening what I came here tonight to say, rather than let you learn it in the middle of a crisis I might have prevented. But I find some things, once decided, cannot wait politely for a better moment. Margaret Hartley, I have watched you tend a garden no one asked you to grow, and correct accounts no one will thank you for, and give away your own portion of dinner to children who needed it more, and grieve a good man for 26 years with a constancy I do not believe I have ever seen matched in anyone, myself included. I do not offer you flattery. I have never had much use for it. I offer you only the truth, which is that I would like very much to spend whatever years remain to me learning the rest of what there is to know about you, if you will permit it." Somewhere behind them a woman gasped quietly, the particular gasp of a crowd realizing it is witnessing something it will describe for years to come. Margaret did not hear it. She heard only the Duke and the sudden dizzying quiet where 26 years of careful, guarded certainty had stood a moment before. "You do me a great honor, Your Grace," she managed finally, "but I must ask you to be certain. I am not a young woman. I have very little to bring to such a match beyond a talent for mending things, and growing lavender no one else wants." "I have had a great deal of everything money can buy," he said, "and found most of it did not keep me warm on the nights that mattered. I would rather have a woman who tends what she loves faithfully for 26 years than a fortune that came with no loyalty attached to it at all. I am entirely certain, Miss Hartley. I have not been certain of very much in a long while. I find the feeling suits me." Cordelia, standing some feet away, had gone the color of old ash. The rumor she had spent an evening's cruelty constructing had not merely failed. It had done the opposite of what she intended, laying bare, in front of the very society whose good opinion she prized above almost everything else, the smallness of the woman who had spread it and the quiet, unassailable dignity of the woman she had tried to diminish. No one in that room would say, aloud, that they had seen through Cordelia Hartley that evening. County society rarely condemns so plainly. But Margaret, watching her cousin's wife's face in the moment the truth landed, understood that something had shifted permanently, that Cordelia would be invited, from this evening forward, to fewer houses and remembered less kindly at the ones that still received her, and that no one would need to say a single unkind word about it for the change to be felt by everyone, including Cordelia herself. There was, in Cordelia's ruined face, for just a moment, something Margaret had never once let herself look for in 11 years of small daily cruelties. Not triumph at her own undoing, but something closer to pity, because underneath the anger and the humiliation Margaret could see, plainly now, the shape of a frightened woman who had built her whole sense of worth on a marriage made for security rather than love, and who could not bear to be reminded by anyone's happiness but her own of the bargain she had made. It did not excuse what Cordelia had done. It only made it, in the end, a smaller and sadder thing than Margaret had spent 11 years believing it to be. "I would ask a mercy of you," Margaret said quietly to the Duke before the evening could go any further, "if it is within your power to grant it. Anything within reason. Do not pursue her for this. Do not ruin her further than the room has already ruined her tonight. I have spent 26 years learning that grief answered with more grief only makes a longer chain of it. I would rather she be left to live with what she has done than be made to suffer for it beyond what tonight has already cost her." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something in his face. She would come to know that particular expression well, in the years ahead. The look of a man revising his estimation of a person upward yet again, softened into something very near reverence. "You are, I think," he said, "the most forgiving person I have ever met, and the most undeserving of needing to be." "Perhaps," Margaret said. "Or perhaps I have simply learned that mercy costs less than bitterness in the end, and lasts a great deal longer." He did not press her further. He gave his word, there in the ballroom, with half the county still watching, that no further word of the matter would come from him, and he kept it in the years that followed exactly as promised. Cordelia was not ruined outright. There was no scandal loud enough to be called by that name. But she was, from that evening forward, quietly and permanently diminished, invited nowhere that mattered, her opinion sought by no one who had once courted it, left to live out her days in the smaller, colder society of people who had never troubled to know the whole truth of what happened that night. It was, Margaret thought, watching her cousin's wife slip quietly from the ballroom sometime before the last dance, a fitting enough justice for a cruelty that had never once raised its voice. The music began again. The Duke offered Margaret his arm, and she took it, and if her hand trembled slightly as she did, no one in that room, watching the steadiness with which he led her out onto the floor, would have called it anything but happiness. They were married the following spring, in a ceremony small enough to fit inside the walled garden at Ashcombe House, among family and the handful of friends who had never once needed proof of Margaret's worth to see it plainly. She was 46 years old by then, and she wore, pinned at her collar where anyone might see it, a small ring on a fine chain beside the one the Duke had given her. Thomas's ring, kept 26 years in a drawer alongside an unsent letter, worn now not in secret and not in shame, but simply carried, the way a person carries the whole of who they have been into the life they are only beginning. The Duke had understood, before she ever explained it to him, that a woman does not stop loving well by loving again, and that asking her to set aside the grief that had shaped her would have been asking her to set aside a part of the very steadiness he had come to love. He had said as much to her, quietly, the night before the wedding, that he did not wish to replace what she had lost, only to stand beside her while she carried it, for as long as she wished to carry it, and that he considered it no small honor to be loved by a heart that had already proven itself capable of loving faithfully for a quarter of a century without once growing tired. He had ordered, weeks before the wedding, an entire bed of lavender planted along the south wall of the walled garden, grown not from purchased stock, but from cuttings his own gardener had quietly taken, on his private instruction, from the small cracked clay pots behind the kitchens at Fenwick Hall, the very plants Margaret had knelt in the frost to save on the night he first saw her, mocked for years by a household that had never once understood what they were looking at. He had told no one what he had done until the morning of the wedding itself, when he led her out into the garden before the guests arrived and let her see it for herself. A whole wall of lavender, already beginning to bud in the early spring warmth, filling the walled garden with a scent she had spent 26 years growing in secret, a handful of stems at a time, in pots no bigger than a wash basin. Margaret stood before it for a long moment without speaking, one hand pressed to her mouth, and when she finally turned to him, her eyes were bright with a feeling she no longer had any reason to hide. "You remembered," she said, "which pots were mine." "I remembered everything about that night," he said. "I have thought of very little else since. A man does not forget the exact moment he understood what kindness looks like when it expects nothing in return. It was only lavender, Your Grace." "It was never only lavender," he said, "and I think you have always known that, even when you told yourself otherwise." They were married that afternoon beneath a wall thick with the scent of it, and the small crowd of witnesses, his sisters, her cousin, a handful of servants who had known her kindness longest and loved her best for it, would say for years afterward that they had never seen a bride look less like a woman marrying a duke and more like a woman finally, quietly, coming home. The years that followed were not without their small sorrows, as all years are, but they were, for the first time in Margaret's adult life, years lived without the particular ache of being overlooked. She ran Ashcombe House with the same quiet competence she had once brought to Fenwick Hall's account books, though now the ledgers she balanced were her own, and the servants she looked after were treated, under her care, with a gentleness the house had not much practiced under its previous mistress. She kept the letter to Thomas, still folded small, in the top drawer of a new writing desk in a house that was, for the first time, entirely hers, and she found she no longer needed to hide it, because the Duke, on the rare occasions he came across it while searching the desk for some other paper, only ever closed the drawer again with the same careful respect a man shows a room he has been asked not to enter, understanding it was not his to read, only hers to keep. A daughter was born to them the following winter, small and healthy and loud in the particular way infants are loud when they intend to be heard, and Margaret, holding her for the first time by the fire in the long gallery at Ashcombe House, found herself weeping in a way she had not permitted herself to weep in 26 years. Not from grief this time, but from the simple, overwhelming fact of having so very much, after having trained herself for so long to expect so very little. The Duke, watching her from the doorway, understood the tears for what they were, and did not interrupt them, only came and sat beside her, and let his hand rest over hers where it curled around their daughter's small foot, and said nothing at all, because some moments, he had learned from his wife, are better honored by silence than filled with words. They named the girl Thomasina, after the man Margaret had loved at 19 and never stopped honoring, a choice the Duke had suggested himself, before Margaret could quite bring herself to ask for it, because he understood, better than most men of his rank and history ever learned to, that love does not require a woman to forget who she was before it found her, and that a man secure in being loved has no need to erase the loves that came before him. Visitors to Ashcombe House, in the years that followed, would often remark on the strange, particular devotion with which the Duke tended that long bed of lavender himself each spring, refusing to let the gardeners near it, kneeling in the dirt in his own shirt sleeves with a care that seemed, to those who did not know the story, somewhat beneath a man of his station. Margaret never explained it to them, and neither did he. It was, between the two of them, a private language that needed no translating. A garden that had once grown in secret, in cracked clay pots, tended by a woman no one thought to notice, now grown into something whole and thriving and impossible to overlook, exactly the way its keeper had grown into the life she had once believed was closed to her forever. Margaret Elspeth Hartley, who had spent 26 years believing her chance at love had gone down with a ship in a storm off the Portuguese coast, lived the rest of her long life instead in a house that smelled of lavender every spring, beside a man who had followed a light across a dark garden expecting to find nothing at all, and had found instead everything he had not known he was still permitted to want. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.